My name is Paul Mogush. I work for the City of Minneapolis in the Department of Community Planning and Economic Development. Is that better if I speak? Okay. My name is Paul Mogush. I work for the City of Minneapolis. I'm a city planner. And you are at the session called Mapping Prejudice. And we're having this presentation and discussion today. One, because it's important and fascinating history and a really incredible project that Kevin and Penny and others are working on. But the reason we're talking about it today in this room is in the context of the city's comprehensive plan update. Does anybody know what the comprehensive plan is? Familiar with the comprehensive plan? Maybe a third of us here? Okay. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this because I want to make sure we spend most of our time talking about the substance of what we're here to talk about. But the comprehensive plan is a document, it's an official legal document that all cities in the metro area here are required to do under state statute, and they lay out a vision for the future of the city, especially as it relates to buildings and the physical development of the city. We're a growing city. We're going to grow by tens of thousands more people in the coming decades, so we need to be ready for that. The growth is happening whether or not we plan, so we're going to plan for that. And the way we're going to do that is our city has made a commitment to grow in equity, to grow in health, and to grow in opportunity. That's the mission statement for Minneapolis 2040, which is the name of the comprehensive plan update. The City Council has adopted 6 values that we are keeping in mind as we decide how we're going to grow between now and 2040. Growth, equity, sustainability, livability, competitiveness, that's in terms of economic competitiveness, and good government. We're going to come back to this in a minute. The plan covers a wide range of topics. Land use and transportation and housing are some of the core topics that people who are familiar with comprehensive plans think of when they think of a comprehensive plan. And at the City of Minneapolis, we are making efforts to broaden that to cover a wider range of topics that you see up here. Not everything about these topics, but how these topics relate to the physical development of the city. We're in the middle of a engagement process. We're checking in with the public from time to time as we develop this plan. We started last year building awareness, and in this past fall, in October, during what's shown here as the big questions phase of the plan, we did a round of public engagement with a couple of big events, one at the Global Market and one at North Commons, and a number of other more focused conversations around the city. Here we are in April. We're doing another one of these engagement pushes starting here at the Community Connections Conference. I hope you all had a chance to visit some of the fun activities going on out in the hallway. We'll be back in the summer with more, again in January of next year. And a year from now, approximately, we expect the plan to be complete and sent on to the Metropolitan Council for their review. And as we've been having these conversations with folks around the city, it's become clear that one of these 6 values stands out above the rest. We heard a commitment from the City Council, from the steering committee that's overseeing this plan update, that equity is important, and racial equity in particular. And then when we went out to the public for some in-depth conversations in October, we heard the same thing from the people of Minneapolis. So that's why we're here to talk about Mapping Prejudice today, and racially restrictive covenants in particular, is that is one among many pieces of the puzzle about why we have the racial disparities that we know we have today. And we feel it's important to have that discussion first and to acknowledge the past and how that affects the situation that we continue to be in terms of disparities, racial disparities in particular. So, I'd like to introduce our two presenters and thank them very much for being here. Kevin Ehrman-Solberg is the project manager of Mapping Prejudice. He's a graduate student at the U of M in geography. Thank you for reminding me. And Penny Petersen is a local historian. She's the author of 2 books and a property records specialist, which comes in handy because this is all about property records. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. Are you starting or Penny?
Yeah.
So Kevin, come on up. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Slide's going. All right, it'll be easier if we switch spots.
Keep your mouth in front of that microphone.
All right, and whoever the nice person was, please correct me if I start straying afield.
I don't think it's in a good spot.
We'll make do. Well, thank you, Paul, for inviting us here to speak today. I'm the project manager for Mapping Prejudice. This is an intersectional and interdisciplinary project that's based at through Historiapolis, which is I'll talk some more about that in a little bit. And what I want to do here today is talk briefly about some of the historic context around different ways that race was being reconceived and reimagined in the early 20th century and how this led to a whole host of new segregative mechanisms. I'm going to talk a bit about our project specifically and how we're tracking racial covenants in Minneapolis, and then afterwards I'd love to hear your comments and your feedback. This is very much a community-oriented project. We are working very much in a public history model. We believe in shared authority, and we want to avoid any kind of monolithic academic renderings of what this means. We can do the work. We can't necessarily or I should say, I don't feel comfortable necessarily saying why this matters. I think that's a community conversation that I would hope to help to catalyze. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a profound shift in how cities in the United States of America were imagining themselves. And really for the first time, at least in the history of the United States, you start to see this rise of centralized planning and the increasing stratification of urban space. 19th century urban models really favored mixed use. There wasn't necessarily a clear distinction between neighborhoods and commercial zones and industrial districts. This was sort of a new idea that emerged in the early 20th century. And as cities became increasingly organized and structured from the top down, how to qualitatively assess these different areas became of paramount importance. If we're going to have separate residential districts, what makes the ideal residential district? What does a good neighborhood look like? And that process was explicitly racial. And there was this basic conflation that was made during this period that the racial identity of an area, the race of those who occupy an area, determine the quality of that area or the perceived desirability of that area. And this was all based on this kind of underlying racist assumption that white space is fundamentally more desirable and more preserves property values better. Based on this kind of change in discourse and change in how we understand our cities, a whole host of new segregation mechanisms sprung up all over the country at the local, state, and federal level. The Federal Housing Administration used policies of redlining, which made it incredibly difficult for people of color to get federally backed mortgages for large swaths of Minneapolis. Municipal zoning, this didn't take place locally here, but it was common in other cities where municipal legislatures would pass laws that made it illegal to live in certain areas of the city if you were not Caucasian. Homeowner associations, and this operated more at a local level where groups of neighbors would get together, often signing contracts that would say that we all agree that we will not sell our property to anybody who isn't white. And some homeowner association tactics even veered closer to what we today would consider terrorism. The most famous example in Minneapolis is the Lee House, which was south of 46 46, okay. And what happened there, if you're not familiar, is an African-American family moved in the early 1930s, and within a few days, thousands and thousands of white neighbors surrounded the house, they vandalized the house, they killed the family's pets. It got violent and brutal enough that the children required a police escort to go to and from school. So not only do you see segregation happening at this broader federal FHA level, but it's also happening at a very local, almost grassroots type of racism. And finally, and this connects most directly to what we're doing with Mapping Prejudice, is the emergence of real estate boards. And baked into the professional code of ethics for real estate agents was racism. It was considered unethical for a real estate agent to sell a home in a white community to anybody who wasn't white. What we're looking with in Mapping Prejudice is specifically kind of one very specific way of enforcing segregation on the urban streetscape, and these are known as racial covenants. And we have a couple covenants that we'll read to you right now that were from here in Minneapolis. You want to come up here, Penny? And as the property record specialist, I think this is...
I'm really very, very good at reading. So you can do like this, This is the earliest racial covenant that I have found. It's from 1910. It's along the West River Road area. And it reads, this isn't the very first one. I'll read that earlier. It's illegal. The party of the second part agrees that they'll never sell, and their heirs agree that property will never be sold to a person of Negro race or to any person married to or living with a person of the Negro race. This is actually the first covenant or the earliest covenant I found. It is further mutually covenanted that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. Such restrictions and covenants shall run with the land, and any breach of any of either thereof shall work a forfeiture of title, which may be enforced by re-entry. In other words, if you violated this, you lost the property and any equity you had in it. So people tended to obey. I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Penny. So as you can see, this up a little bit. Yeah, as you just heard, these racial restrictions were incredibly explicit and left little doubt as to which groups were being targeted here in Minneapolis. Covenants began here locally in 1910. The practice originated in California in the 1880s. It was a tool that was used to prevent Asian immigrants from purchasing homes in California cities. The practice was encouraged by the federal government. The FHA, the organization responsible for redlining cities, based their redlining in part on the density of racial covenants. If an area had a large number of racial covenants, this was far more likely to be deemed a desirable property by the FHA. Areas without racial covenants were much more likely to be redlined. By the 1930s, at least here in Minneapolis, this appears to be standard practice. The majority of properties that we've looked at after that date do have these racial restrictions attached to them. And perhaps the most insidious part of these restrictions was that they enforced intergenerational segregation. The way that a covenant works is it's attached to the warranty deed of a piece of property. Because this restriction is in the warranty deed, that restriction tracks with the land and not the owner. So to give you an example, if I put a racial covenant on my home, sold it to Penny, Penny sold it to somebody else, and that person sold it to somebody who wasn't Caucasian, that person still breached the covenant, they would lose the house, and it would revert back to me, the original owner. Or the original grantor, I should say, the person who first put that restriction into the title record. They were finally made illegal in 1968 by the Fair Housing Act. In Minnesota, they were ruled illegal in the 1950s, and there was a Supreme Court ruling in the late 40s that made them unenforceable. But for the majority of the 20th century, this was a legal thing that you could do. You could place these restrictions onto your property. What we're doing with Mapping Prejudice is, this is the first ever attempt to fully account for the number of racial restrictions, racial covenants specifically, in an American city. No city has ever built a database that shows the full extent of these restrictions. The way that we're doing this is through a partnership. Historiapolis, which is located at Augsburg College, Kirsten Delegard, the director, she first conceived of this project. She heard of a similar project in Seattle, which found several hundred racial restrictions and wanted to know if this could this could be duplicated here at a larger scale. The Borchard Map Library at the University of Minnesota, and CURA, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, which has provided a generous amount of financial support for this project. And together we hope to build the first database and first real map of racial restrictions for an urban area in the United States of America. What I'm going to show you now.
Your research also includes the covenants against Jewish?
Oh, we'll talk. Give me 1 minute, I'll talk about that. So, what you see right here is a time-lapse map that shows all the restrictions that we have found thus far. If you look in the bottom left, that says the year, so 1920, 1924. The dots on the map show the spread of these racial restrictions throughout the city of Minneapolis. As of right now, we have mapped about 5,000 restrictions. We think this is about maybe 20% of the total number of restrictions in the city. We've only looked at around 20,000 properties, so this is very much a work in progress. And despite how prevalent they appear in this visualization, if anything, this is grossly underestimating the total number of racial restrictions that existed in the city of Minneapolis. So, how are we doing this? The initial work and all of the restrictions that you just saw on that map so far were actually manually compiled by Penny Petersen. There's a reason why we call her the best property records researcher in the state. She went through reels and reels of microfiche at the county registrar's office, just manually looking to find where these restrictions. And that work proved our initial kind of proof of concept that, yes, this was a practice that existed here in Minneapolis. And then the next question, excuse me. The next question was, how can we scale this up a little bit? The problem with the manual method of investigation for these restrictions, to put this in context, for Hennepin County between 1900 and 1960, there's 1.4 million warranty deeds that have been logged in the county registrar's office. So to manually go through these is just not practical. In order to kind of meet our goal of finding all the restrictions for an American city, we're using something called optical character recognition, or OCR. And how OCR works is essentially it's a machine learning thing that you can do with computers where you send in digitized images that have words written on them. The computer kind of translates these into what you would think of as like a Word document. Once you have it translated into a Word document, we can start searching for individual terms. And you heard the language in the covenants that Penny used earlier, or that Penny read earlier. So we're looking for words like Negro and colored, Turkish, Mongoloid, Caucasian. Whenever the OCR hits on one of these terms, we take that deed and separate it from the 1.4 million. And as of Thursday night, we're actually done with the OCR methodology for all of Hennepin County, and we have somewhere north of 30,000 deeds that contain racial restrictions. I do want to point out that's for the county, not just Minneapolis. We have to do a separate stratification to extract out the ones that were local to Minneapolis. So property records aren't logged at the city level, they're logged at the county level, so that's just kind of the nature of the data. But suffice to say that, yes, we have found tens and tens of thousands of these in Hennepin County. Once we have used the OCR engine to kind of flag the deeds that contain racial language, we read through them and we extract out certain pieces of attribute information. This is how we are able to map these restrictions. Here's an example deed right here. I'm not sure if you can read the language, but this is what a standard Minneapolis warranty deed looks like. Nothing too exciting. The highlighted areas in yellow are the terms that the OCR picked up on. So this one picked up on the word Caucasian as well as the word race. These flag deed images, we read through and enter certain kind of pieces of information into what we call an attribute database, and it's just a fancy computer term for glorified Excel spreadsheet. We're looking for things like the edition name, the block number, the lot number, the book page, when the deed was first granted, when it was executed, who bought it, who sold it, and the language of the racial restriction. This builds attribute database that contains kind of the information for each racial covenant in the city of Minneapolis. The next step is Like, how do we map this, right? And we're doing that by constructing what's called a spatial database. And we started with the 2010 Hennepin County shapefile, and a shapefile is basically a computer file that has a polygon that denotes spaces with latitude and longitudinal coordinates. And the Hennepin County shapefile has a lot boundary for every lot that currently exists in the city of Minneapolis. The problem is that historic lot boundaries and contemporary lot boundaries are not always the same. What was once Kevin's addition to the city of Minneapolis, Block 1, Lot 1, is now Kmart. So we need to find a way to kind of rectify this so we can have the attribute information join the spatial information and that the spatial information is correct. So we're fortunate the Hennepin County shapefile actually notes when, in the file itself, it notes when lot boundaries have changed. So we remove everything that's changed, and that's what it looks like when you strip out all the lots that have different boundaries now than they did when they were first platted. We then manually draw in the missing lots. Once we have our attribute database completed and we have the spatial database completed, we can now merge these two together through what's called an attribute join. And the way we're doing that is with something called a primary key. So the addition name, the lot number, and the block number, this creates kind of like a unique identifier. Based on this unique identifier, we can take the attribute database, so each kind of line of racial covenant data, and match it to each spatial coordinate that exists in the Hennepin County shapefile. And together, that's to map and visually display these racial covenants for the city of Minneapolis. We're still very much in the early stages of this project. The OCR has just completed, but we haven't mapped many of those deeds yet. So we haven't. I'm a little leery of drawing too many early conclusions about this data, but based on our initial sample size, some things are becoming pretty apparent. And one of the most, I think, profound takeaways of this project is the way that racial covenants worked together with redlining to dramatically stratify the city of Minneapolis. You kind of get this 1-2 punch where redlining makes it so a large, half of the city you can't get a federally backed loan if you try to buy there. If the other half is racially covenanted and you're African American or Chinese, Turkish, you've heard the terms in the deed, it's illegal for you to buy that home. And together this made it incredibly difficult for people of color to purchase homes in the city of Minneapolis for a large portion of the 20th century. This disparity in patterns of property ownership has carried through today. In Minneapolis, white families are 3 times as likely to own their homes as African American families. So this sort of structural inequality really set the stage for contemporary disparities in the city of Minneapolis. The other, initial takeaway from this is that current demographic patterns adhere remarkably closely to where these covenants were located in the 20th century. This is a population map that's showing the proportion of people of color in different areas of Minneapolis. The whiter areas have a higher percentage of Caucasians. The darker areas have a higher percentage of people of color. And you can see that the areas, the little red dots on there, those are the covenants that we've found. The areas with a high density of covenants are by far the whitest areas of the city today. And again, this is an incomplete data set, but you can already start to see, like, especially if you go up to North Minneapolis where you have these kind of bastions of whiteness. I mean, those were the homes that were racially covenanted back in the 40s, back in the 50s, back in the 30s. So where do we go from here? Or at least as a project, where do we go from here? And there's still much to do. The OCR, that should say 100% complete now, and that should say 30,000 flagged images. I have not updated this slide recently. The 30,000 deeds that we found that contain racial language, they cover all of Hennepin County, and we need to extract the attribute information out of those so that we can continue our work of mapping these restrictions for Minneapolis. And the way that we're doing that is through a crowdsourcing program or platform called Zooniverse. And Zooniverse was developed at the University of Minnesota in conjunction with Oxford in the UK. And it's a way to kind of crowdsource research tasks to a general audience. So what we've done is I built a project page on Zooniverse, and all the deed images that contain racial language we've uploaded. So volunteers can go on. It will randomly select a deed image that has racial language, and we just ask a couple simple questions on the right. What was the addition name? Is there actually a racial covenant? The OCR process, it's remarkably good, but it's not perfect. Some words like white, for example. Most of the time that'll denote a racial covenant. Sometimes somebody named, Richard White bought a home. So like there are some false matches in there. And while we can automate a lot of what we're doing, we still need human eyes on each one of these records in order to finish the mapping process. And we hope that with enough Zooniverse volunteers, we can complete our work within the year, at least for the city of Minneapolis, and then from there, hopefully branch this out to the rest of Hennepin County. So that's pretty much all that I have for a formal presentation. Somebody asked about anti-Semitic covenants. I will touch on that briefly, and then I'll open this up to kind of more broader discussion. And interestingly, we've only found about 24 racial covenants that are explicitly anti-Semitic. So the vast majority that we've found do explicitly target African Americans. Very few target, or at least very few seem to target Jewish folks. This is a little bit problematic because a lot of covenants also have a restriction that says can only be sold to members of the so-called Caucasian race. So the legal definition of so-called Caucasian race, I mean, this is a pretty broad, it has changed. And whether, so are Jewish, is that a religion? Is that an ethnicity? And this really kind of speaks to the absurdity of using racial categorizations to enforce laws because how do you define these? I am comfortable with saying that we have not found many that explicitly target Jewish folks. That doesn't mean that anti-Semitism didn't exist in Minneapolis, and there's certainly other ways of keeping, undesirable people out of your community other than racial covenants.